So great. It's good to welcome those of you connecting into this online conversation, which is what we called a learning through lockdown discussion, where it's great to welcome three friends of the association to come and join us and share their wisdom with us. Well, I say three friends. Marjorie, I'll come to you first. You're more than a friend of the association. You're part of the association. So, you've been involved in so much of what's been happening in association life. Marjorie Allen, co-leader at the Well Baptist Church in Sheffield. It's great to have Alex here as well. Who's senior leader at the Beacon Church in Stafford and led our ministers conference last year and been involved in other things within the association. It's great to have Ken Benjamin, who was at Chichester Baptist Church, but recently, Ken, you've moved role and now you've got this great, huge title, Director of Church Relationships. We'll hear about that later at London Institute of Contemporary Christianity, LIC. And that means a lot to us in the association because we're partnering with you as we look to the future. And we'll be able to talk about that a little later on. But also you've been here in the association just in the last 18 months during your presidential year, and people really valued your input. So it's great to have you with us. And the purpose of this next half an hour or so is to have an informal conversation about being a church in such a time as this. Of course, whether this refers to the global pandemic that the world is facing. And actually, we've all seen the reality of the global pandemic and the impact of it. Just this last week, 100,000 deaths that the world has faced. And you only had to watch the news, didn't you, to be touched yourself. But there'll be people in your own congregations where you've seen the reality of that. It's tough. I don't know about what you're experiencing. It's tough at the moment. People found it hard in lockdown 1 and lockdown 2, but as we go to lockdown 3 and there seems no end to it, it seems particularly tough. So I guess I wanted to ask you how you're finding it yourself as being a leader in a time like this. Alex, let me ask you first.
Thanks, Graham. So it must have been last summer, Andy Glover, some of us might know Andy, he shared this illustration of what it feels like, and it's just resonated with me and is how I feel. And he described it like a triathlon, that the pandemic and the lockdowns and the experience is a bit like a triathlon, but a triathlon no one told you were entering and which you haven't trained for. And that's certainly how it felt for me. So if I go back to March, you know, and the announcements of lockdown and how everything changed and all the rest of it, there was so much to do. I didn't know it was coming. None of us were aware of it until a month or so before, a few weeks before. And then everything changed. And it felt like that swim in a triathlon. You know, I'm swimming away and swimming away. I haven't trained for it. No one trained me for this. No one trained my leaders, all these fantastic volunteers. We're just desperately trying to keep our heads above water and swimming. And then we got to about the summer, and it felt to me I clambered out the water and thought, we've made it. We've made it. From September, everything becomes a bit normal. We're there. The kids are going back to school. Church is starting to reemerge. We've made it. I've survived. And then all of a sudden, November came and someone threw a bike at me and said, now get on this bike. You've got a 100-kilometer cycle to do. And I never trained for this. And I'm really exhausted. And off we went on the bike ride. We got through that, hit Christmas. And then come January, someone said, oh, did you know there's now a marathon you need to run, Alex? And I haven't trained for that either. And I'm absolutely exhausted. And no one said this was coming. And certainly for me, just talking very personally, Graham, like that's kind of how I feel. I'll put my hands up and say I feel pretty weary and pretty tired. And I feel like I'm running a marathon off the back of a massive cycle, a massive swim. And I didn't train for it. And no one kind of told me it was coming. That doesn't mean I'm not full of hope and full of excitement. I'll look forward to talking about that in a moment or two. But I think honest reflection is needed, isn't it? And for me, it's not going to be everyone's story, but I feel pretty emotionally, mentally, and physically exhausted by this triathlon I haven't trained for and no one told me was coming. So I don't know if that's a bit of a despondent note. It's
an honest note. I think it's really helpful because I think we are finding it tough. Do you find that in church life, Marjorie, as we go into lockdown 3, sort of coming to it again? Actually, people are finding it harder this time, not just yourself, but people within the church.
Absolutely, Graham. I think I see that across the board. I think for those in positions of leadership across their workplaces, just as Alex has articulated, they are exhausted. So the medical professionals, the head teachers, etc., we pray a lot for those guys. I think the constant shifting sands is very tiring for psychologically for any human being. I think for everybody with children, ourselves included here, it's just vulnerable, isn't it? Because it's chaos, the trying to work and homeschool. And, so I just ran out to check, maths class was going to happen, and not Xbox. And that is, in many ways, there's a level playing field. But is it harder now? Absolutely. And probably because of fatigue. I find that perspective is huge for me personally. So keeping our eyes on God, on what he is doing as well, not on what's not possible and what he's not doing. But that doesn't mean that we just go from glory to glory and it's not hard. So I think perspective is really important, but permission as well for people to say, yes, it is really tough. We might not be dying, or it might not be as it was in World War situations, but it is still really, really difficult for people right now. And I think acknowledging that, acknowledging it's really difficult for young people on what they're missing out in is actually crucial for us to carry love and compassion towards one another.
Yeah. Yeah, and Ken, you've changed roles. It's quite interesting as you move from a local church perspective, I guess, which Alex and Marjorie bring a little bit, to this sort of wider perspective. Does that give you a different view of things now? Just moving from a local church sort of look like to this sort of national role with Lick? Do you see a bigger picture of what's going on?
I think both and, Graham, for sure. So, if it had been like a 3-month lockdown and COVID, I would have felt, okay, we'd learned some lessons. That's been really tough. Let's move on now. But it is, that triathlon analogy is really good, because it has felt like either I told myself or other people told us false finish lines. So you kept preparing yourself for the next finish line. If we get there, then that'll be okay. And somebody kept moving the goalposts.
Yeah.
And so in that period, my daughter got married, which was wonderful, but all the challenges of doing that in COVID. My son moved and found a job, but all the challenges of doing that in COVID. My mum got dementia and had to go into a home, empty a house, and do that in COVID. Trying to sell a house and move, which I know Marjorie's doing too, and starting a new job, meeting a new staff team online. It's been a challenging time, and I hadn't prepared myself for how tiring some things are, how tiring some of the not going anywhere but doing everything on screens can be, for example. So just to give myself a little bit more slack when you expect to do more because you're not commuting is a false expectation, for example.
I think that's really helpful. I think it's also helpful because it's about being kind to ourselves, isn't it? Sometimes we push ourselves so much that sometimes we try and do more all the time. And like you say, it is wearying and challenging. And the reality of everyday life, it becomes more complicated. I guess going into this conversation, one of the things I thought about, if you'd have known at the beginning what you know now, how would you do things differently? What would have been your priorities if you'd have known at the beginning what you know now, known at the beginning of lockdown what you know now? Marjorie, what would you say?
Sometimes it's good not to be able to see ahead, isn't it? Too much.
Yeah.
I think if I had known then, I might have sank in what was coming. I think, key for us since the beginning as a team, Graham, that I'm really grateful that we've held this is from day one, my husband said to the team, we're going to always focus on what we can do, not what we can't do. And I want this conversation to be that and to flow from that. Back in March, when Boris made his first announcement, we gathered as a team. It was our last time to be able to do it quite like that, and a whiteboard meeting. It was like a Cobra team. What will we do? What can we do? And obviously we've had to change and shift that all the time, sometimes week by week. But I found that really, really helpful, and we have to go back to that. So I don't think I would change that. I think that has been absolutely key for us all along, to focus on what he is doing in the midst of it, not maybe what plans we are doing, and ask him to bless that.
Alex?
It's interesting. I was reflecting on it. You sent these questions in advance, so I've been pondering on it, and to some extent, actually struggling to pin down an answer, interestingly. I think Marjorie's first comment there resonates with me definitely as well, about if we sometimes it's useful God doesn't show us the future. You know, if some of what I know now, if I'd known at the beginning, I'm not sure would have done us a world of good as a church, you know, if that makes sense. I guess looking back, the things I would have done more of if I'd known it was going to be this long would have been all those connecting and relational things. So we lent into them very, very hard from the beginning anyway. And we said, in any ways we can help people to relate, because fundamentally reaching people who don't know Jesus and growing up as his disciples is done through relationships, fundamentally. And so we lent very hard into that, but I probably would have lent even harder into that. And interestingly, Marjorie's language that she talked about Nick using right at the beginning was exactly our language we used across our leadership teams, which was, let's not focus on what we can't do, let's focus on what we can do. But interestingly, about in the summer, September time maybe, I reflected on that and thought, actually, I'm not entirely sure for us whether that served us as well as the question, what should we do? So I think we took that, what can we do? And we lent really hard into it. So every time a lockdown eased and churches could meet, we're like, we can do this, we can do this. So we threw all sorts of energy into creating a gathering. And I'm not sure in hindsight I would have done that. And come September time, we shifted the question from let's not talk about what we can do and then automatically just kind of do it because the government says we can. Let's now ask the question, what should we do in that bigger perspective of where God is taking us as a church and as a body, actually. And for us, that is much more towards the small. I love small church. I'm a huge believer in small church. It's what we're trying to be, is lots of characteristics of small church because it's so relational. So actually what we should do is put all our energy into resources into helping people know how to relate to each other, and helping people know how to be friends, and helping people to know how to build good community. That's what we should be doing. After we've answered that, now let's look at if we can do it or not. So I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but so our questions evolved from let's not focus on what we can't do to what we can do. It then evolved to say, actually, what should we do in discerning where God is taking us and moving forward? So that's as good as I've got in answer to that question, Graham.
No, it's really helpful, and the whole thing about being built for relationship is key, isn't it? There's something deeply theological about that. You know, God is a God of relationship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and He's built us as people of relationship. Connecting with Him, connecting with each other is really key. And I guess it's been really interesting, the whole thing. The more you throw at everything, the more wearying it becomes. So at some point, you have to discern what you need to commit yourself to. Would you say that's true, Ken?
If I take your wider question, Graham, of what would I've liked to have known right at the beginning, I would have liked to have known how unequal this has been for different people. It hasn't just highlighted inequalities among those who have and those who have not. It's exacerbated those inequalities. And I didn't see that coming. And I would have liked to have known that, because we could have prioritized that in church community, in my church community and other church communities more. Linked to that, the extent to which this has highlighted and exacerbated mental health issues is something I would have wanted a heads up on right at the start. Could have focused on that. And I highlight those two things because I think I went into solution mode like so many of us did. So I it's like I leapt to a solution, I would say, rather than fell to prayer. And if I started again now, knowing what I know now, then if I'd fallen to prayer, I might have seen more the inequalities of it and the mental health issues around it.
I guess that's our instinctive response. It's sort of to respond to the situation. That's what you're all saying, isn't it? And over time, is to sort of take a step back and not just respond, but to discern. There's so many things we can do, but what should we do? What's God calling us to do? And I guess He's calling each different church to do something slightly different in the community in which they find themselves. I read this, I don't know if you read it, in The Guardian just over Christmas, actually, from Simon Jenkins. It was a sort of provocative article. I'd be fascinated how you'd respond. Well, I know you'll respond in some ways, but let me read it to you first. He says, "We all know the future. It's online, home delivery, click and collect, view on demand. It's goodbye to the high street. Farewell butcher, baker and bricklayer's arms." But then he asks the question, but is it also goodbye church? Of course, you're going to say, no, it's not goodbye church. But the real question, if I was to push you, is in relation to what we're seeing nationally. Huge decline of the church. And the challenge is, you know, you're from large churches, so you'll be able to tell great stories, but huge decline within the church nationally. So a secular commentator is asking that question, looking at the reality of what's being faced. With 2,000 Anglican churches, for example, you know, having congregations of less than 12, 70% of our Baptist churches being small churches, congregations less than 40. So there's a constant decline. How would you respond to that, though, in light of those statistics? And what's the evidence from your perspective to say, because I know you'll say this, the future's bright for the church? Is it goodbye for the church? Alex, you're straight in, mate. I'd see.
Without trying to be provocative, in the way Simon Jenkins, was it? That article was by Jenkins, wasn't it? I think I want to say, I hope it is goodbye to the church in the way that he is imagining church, in what he pictures and how he defines that word church. If we asked him to write 2 paragraphs about what he means by that word church, I hope it is actually goodbye church, because that encultured model of church hasn't been working for the best part of a century, certainly since World War II, hasn't been working in terms of bringing the truth of who Jesus is and the reality of who Jesus is, his love and his compassion and his justice, into the majority of people's lives in the UK in a way that they find him persuasive and attractive. So, you know, that model of church, which revolves around a particular building and a particular paid professional who stands at the front, and people gather for an hour and a half as the central point. It hasn't been working for a long time, but we have been able to sort of kid ourselves a little bit with an Emperor's New Clothes story that it has, because in some very particular places we have got examples of what looks like a thriving church. There is actually no such thing as a big church or a large church in the UK. There's not. In almost every town, there is not a church that has connection, genuine, real membership equivalent to a decent sized primary school. And yet that town will have half a dozen or 10 primary schools. You know, there's no such thing as a larger church in the UK. So where Simon Jenkins, what he pictures as church, I hope it is goodbye to that. I think churches, we mustn't go back. We mustn't go back. We've got to explore what it means to go forward and build on a model of church which is much more about agility, much more about relationships, much more about coming back to the principles that God gives us in the Bible, not about the structures that we've inherited and think are so important, is much more relational driven. And I'll be honest, is much more about small. The way our society is going, has been going for a long time actually, is towards small. We might like the big gathered events, but actually where people connect is into the small. So I don't have all the answers at all, but without trying to be controversial at anything, Graham, I have incredible hope for the church only if we choose not to go back to a model which is not biblical. It's just our way of doing church. It's not good or it's not bad, but it's no longer relevant or fit for purpose at all for the society we live in. So we need to, I think we need to leave our buildings. We need to leave our big gatherings. We need to leave our professional priesthood. We need to become small. We need to be about anointed amateurs. We need to become about empowered saints. And we need to be much more organic. And if that's the way the church moves, then I think we'll see a significant shift in the spiritual landscape of the UK. If we go back to our buildings and our paid professionals and our ministers and our sermons, we're going to be in all sorts of trouble.
I can see you nodding, Roger. You're smiling at what Alex was like, you know, he was like a greyhound in a box and he was sort of like straight out, you know, sort of keen, straight on.
Alex has been waiting for a time like
that. Yeah.
I would wholeheartedly agree with Alex, and I might temper it to not bring balance, but I suppose I'll answer your question up front, Graham. Do I think it is the end of church? Absolutely not, in the sense of, do we see evidence of people turning to God that we were not reaching before at a time like this? Yes. And a hunger across this nation? Absolutely. And should we not go back? God's people got into trouble in history where they kept looking back, going back. I'm with you, Alex. Let's go forward and take every opportunity.
No, that's an interesting thought. The whole idea of the church being gathered and scattered, you know, gathering in sacred spaces, scattered into their ordinary everyday spaces in which they find themselves. The true model of church. I guess that's be something. Well, that's what Lick's all about, is it, Ken?
You're talking my language, Graham. Absolutely. Yeah.
There you go, you see.
London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, the organisation that I now represent, is about equipping people for the whole of their lives, wherever they find themselves. The banner behind me, "Make a Difference Where You Are," if I'm honest, is there covering up the fact that we're trying to do a house move and there's some boxes behind it, but we'll leave that for one side for the moment. And I think we can say, looking out, that the churches that have got the balance wrong between gathered and scattered have struggled the most in this period. So if you've had such a high emphasis of gathered, that it's all about gathered, that it's all about what happens when you're in one physical place, then you have lost the most, and you are having to reevaluate. If you have been about equipping people for wherever they find themselves, then where they find themselves might have changed, but you are almost certainly are better placed. So now we don't gather just to equip people, we gather to glorify and to edify. So there is that wonderful thing that Marjorie's described when we gather to glorify God, and it's a wonderful, amazing thing when we do that. But also a big part of gathering is to equip our people and each other for when we are scattered wherever we find ourselves. It has to be that.
Maybe this is an appropriate time, Ken, to sort of do our little advert, you know, sort of the partnership between the YBA and Lick. And, you know, we're going to be starting a new learning community in March, and we're inviting churches to participate in it. This whole idea of being trained and equipped to live in the everyday, take Christ with you in the everyday places in which you find yourself. And you're going to be leading us on that. And we've got a sort of like a taster evening on the 23rd of February online.
Yeah, please come along to that taster evening, just to hear what it could look like to journey with us. Regular slots over a couple of years for a church to say, what does it look like if we fully embrace this value and take on board equipping our people for the whole of their lives, wherever they find themselves? How does that affect our gathered space? How does it affect our preaching, our worship? How does it affect how we do small groups, what we prioritize in our discussions, the things that we pray about? We will never get anywhere, I said in my presidential year, until we equip our people for their everywhere. Yeah. And that's more true now, or at least as true now as it has ever been.
And I guess as sort of moving on, that, you know, there's been so many needs within our communities. It's a great opportunity for the church to be able to serve the folk in the communities in which we find ourselves, isn't it? Alex, I sort of looked at the Beacon Church's website this morning. There on the front page, it's got coronavirus community response, sort of one of the big banners right at the top there. What's been happening at the Beacon? How have you been serving the wider community over the last 9 months, 12 months?
Yeah, no, we've been very fortunate, actually. So right at the beginning, back in March time, we were able to partner in lots of ways with lots of different organisations in the town, and to become, if you like, for want of a turn of phrase, a bit of a portal, a bit of a central single point of contact, both for folk who needed help and for folk who are able to offer help. And so we almost just created some kind of matchmaking setup, really, where people could reach out and say, I need this or that, and other people say, look, here's a help I can offer, here's things I can do, and all the rest of it. Mostly on a relatively individual level. You know, other organizations, sometimes other churches, other organizations in the town had things like the major food bank or all that kind of stuff. Ours became much more of a kind of individual portal. And things that have come out of that are things like a bit of a homeschooling network, you know, where different parents have clubbed together with a dozen or so kids, if you like, in the same year, and they're doing online Zoom stuff where that's not being provided by the school, of just teaching. And on the list goes, all sorts of different things to do that. So that for us has been quite thrilling, and that's actually where we've lent as well. We haven't lent towards the big corporate response to coronavirus. We've actually lent to mobilizing individuals to be better able to do their part in their neighborhood, in their street, in their town, whatever that might look like. So that's the shape it's kind of taken for us. But I guess that also speaks to the lean God has given us as a church. So though you describe it as a larger church, and we would by the Baptist definitions of that, actually, you know, we're constantly trying to lean into. It's about individuals reaching individuals. It's about smaller groups of people reaching smaller groups of people. That was the journey we're already on, and we've kind of continued that. Yeah, even in our coronavirus response, we have. Yeah.
Would that be true for you as well, Marjorie? Similar sort of thing?
I would say it's been on 3 levels. So individually, just as Alex has mentioned, so a huge response from the church community to reach out to their streets. We've had prayer walks, several prayer weeks, 24/7 prayer weeks, where we've really prayed for our different neighborhoods. So individuals, every person, every day, everywhere in that way. Then there has been the corporate, as it were. So I think there is something about the church galvanizing as a whole, what we can offer. So we're all the time adapting with that to the circumstances. One that's just launching this Sunday is that Nick has gathered the businessmen in the church, and they have formed something known as a turnaround team. So they are all giving expertise and time to create a mentoring team to help those who are self-employed, those whose businesses have gone under, those who have to make financial decisions, and it's really tough, of which we have many, and young people and self-employed people. So we as the church can respond to this need and be ready to go, as it were, in this immediate season. So that's just one example, really key. And then really exciting has been the citywide initiatives. So there's been a tremendous sense of unity of the churches coming together, particularly around food bank in the city. The multiplication of food bank across Sheffield has been extraordinary. Out of our one food bank, S6 food bank that we support with St. Thomas's Philadelphia, 9 food banks have now emerged. A new one was planted again this week. And that's many churches joining in with unity to serve the poor of the city. So I think it's individual, and then it's what can an individual church with their resources do, and that will be different for each one. So the business guys, we just happen to have quite a few, that wouldn't be every church. And then in other contexts, they had a food bank and we were able to get behind them. So I noticed there's something about churches pooling resources together to bring life to a city that's really key in this time.
Could I just jump in, just Greg?
Yeah, of course, yeah, do that.
I think just listening in, I think one of the key things here is that listening to what God is saying. So, you know, I'm a church leader. I'm incredibly privileged that my income comes through that. Most church leaders are, you know, that's not the case. They're trying to fit around serving a church within all sorts of other paid employment and other things. And so it's especially hard to stop being proactive and to pause and to listen and to say, God, you know, what are the priorities? What is the focus? Where am I to invest my time? How am I to serve the church into this new era, into this new world that is emerging? And discerning, like Ken said earlier and was alluding to there, you know, what's the front line? You know, Ken, earlier you said that as you look back, you perhaps wish you'd fallen into prayer more, and God therefore may have opened your eyes up more clearly to some mental health needs, some equality needs. Well, even more so, I guess I'd want to urge church leaders, and we're doing this as a church across our church. Next week we go into a 5-day fast. You know, all our leaders being invited into that. urging us to stop doing just for a moment and really listen and make sure God is identifying our way forward and what to do, because the needs are going to just get greater and greater, but not every need is a call. We've got to listen to Jesus and got to follow his Holy Spirit and say, okay, this is the way we're going. So there's something just resting on my head there, want to say, don't rush to the need, as massive as it is. Rush to God first. Let him set the priority for you. Could be different to another church down the road or whatever. Hear what God is saying, and then follow him into that space.
That's so helpful. I suppose I'm made to think as well that lots of people who will be listening into this will be leaders, ministers, parts of small congregations. So that might be one of the things that you'd encourage folk to do. I guess also I'd push you back. If you were leading a small church now of 25, so maybe the average congregation in the YBA, average church size, 70% of our churches are small churches under 40. That'd be one of the things that you'd do. What else would you do? What else would you set as a priority to help a church like that to move forward during a time like this?
I'll jump in there, Graham. It was great to spend some time with YBA during the last couple of years, and one of the things we were making a plea for was for smaller churches to do less and do it well. And both Marjorie and Alex have expressed some real optimism about the future being small, and how people will really gravitate to that. And one of the problems smaller churches were articulating was actually how do you stop in order to do less and do it well. So now we've had a forced stop, and there is some pressure to just reintroduce everything, for sure, and some expectation from some in our community. But there is a desperate need to not hear those expectations unless you believe that it's God articulating those expectations. And whilst we might, as church leaders, might be feeling the pressure of that, now is an opportunity like never before to not press reset, a simple reset, and to discern which things to do less and do it well. One of the things that I've been doing, because I have had the time to step back in my new role, is researching what the post-COVID landscape might look like from the point of view of Christian writers and non-Christian writers. And just because everyone is asking this question in industry and a whole variety of places. And it's not just the church world that is pointing to small might have something of a future. I was reading David Minton, who's a fitness industry expert, for example, who's pointing to how everyone's gone online and it's all about, gyms are closed but people are buying gym equipment, and the popularity of Joe Wixon, for example. But then he says, David Minton, that we are social beings in need of motivation from other people, and we will flock back to gyms when we can, although these may increasingly be smaller, community-based gyms offering personal training. So in that world of fitness, he's seeing and predicting that small will be the way forward.
For you, that idea of small church, I mean, that's your direction anyway. In some ways, though it might be talked about a Beacon Church being a large church, actually your vision is to go small anyway. That's where you're at.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and have been for a number of years, for 5 or 6 years now. So anyone who is part of Beacon Church, their experience of when we gathered, even before COVID, would have been in that small church. We had some larger gatherings every now and again to pull everyone together. I'm a huge believer in it. I think, I guess if I was speaking to someone who was serving what we're calling a smaller church versus a larger church. And when I came to Beacon 8 years ago, we were 35 adults, less membership, 35 adults. And I loved it. And I came not expecting it to I wanted to reach new people, of course, but I came wanting to serve a church at that point, I was a bivocational soul minister. I worked at Tesco's as well. And, that's what I thought 30 years would fundamentally look like. And I was really excited about that. God had another thought. It wasn't my thought. God had another thought. But I'm really excited about what we might call smaller church. In fact, what I'm really excited about is is smaller church that is resourced like it is bigger church. That's the dynamic at Beacon. Do you see what I mean? That there's the energy and the impetus and the resourcing of something a little bit larger, but all the intimacy and the mission focus and the community of something that is slightly smaller. I think if you are serving what we're unhelpfully classing as a smaller church, I think I want to reflect on two things. Number one is there's no value to how many people happen to be your membership count. Like our next door neighbor is a single mum with 2 children. We're a married couple with 4 children. There is no value difference in a household of 3 or a household of 6. You're not saying 6 is better than 3 or 3 is better than 6. It does make a difference when you come to serve dinner. You need to know how many people you are serving to make sure they're all fed well. But there's no value difference. And that family of 3 can do things that we as a family of 6 can't do. And we as a family of 6 can do things that that family of 3 can't do. But there's no value difference. So don't aspire to be anything other than what God has made you. Become more what he's made you. The other thing I would want to reflect back to those who perhaps are perhaps unhelpfully classed as one of those smaller churches, because we do subconsciously use that as somehow it's, you know, one day you'll grow up, don't worry, is the power question. You know, don't forget that every church Jesus describes as his body. And therefore, there's nothing stronger on earth than your church. It is the divine body. There is no weakness or fragility about your church. You are Jesus's body. And he describes every church as his bride. There is nothing ugly. There's nothing needs to change about you for Jesus he cannot love you or view you as more precious than he already views you. You're his bride. There is nothing closer to his heart on earth than who you are. And so we just need to quiet those lying voices, perhaps, that say small is weak or small is not as beautiful as big. Realize actually you're exactly who Jesus has made you as a church. You are beautiful as his bride. You are strong as his body. You can do things that a larger church can't do. Just get on and do those things. Having discerned from Jesus, your beautiful husband and your head, having discerned from him what those things are, get on and do it and really celebrate it. I just love smaller communities of Jesus's followers. I think they do mission and they do discipleship really, really well. And that's what we're about.
And just, I found Alex's analogy of him and his family and his neighbour's family really helpful. And so I think the point to emphasize is that God has a best plan and a best way forward for all sizes of church. Mm. And what leaders of larger churches know is that actually community is so vital that as you grow bigger, you also have to grow smaller. And that's been key in the Beacon international churches and in a whole range of other churches, why small groups have become so important in this season. So I do want to emphasize the smaller element, but also I'm convinced that we're in a good place with a variety of different sizes within Baptist Together, and God will have a best way forward for all of those sizes. So I just wanted to say that.
It's great. I guess as we're coming into land, as sort of we sort of try and draw things together, I sort of wonder about trying to connect where we started and where we're ending in terms of the fact people feeling fatigued and weary and tired. And actually part of today was about inspiring people. It's been really inspiring for me sitting here listening to you guys, you know, and learning of all that's going on. But I guess also the question I want to ask is how you look after yourself during times like this, because that's really important that people do look after themselves. So rather than telling other people how to look after themselves, it's really helpful to know how you look after yourself and sort of share your personal experiences that people can learn from, that we can all learn from as we listen to each other. I'm not asked somebody, you see, so I thought I'll just see what happens.
Go, Marjorie, if you like.
Well, we had a live chat about this one in our community last night, Graham, and we thought it was important to focus on the permission giving for people, to acknowledge that it is really hard season, that is actually part of our mental and emotional health. That's really important for us as leaders to give time to that and for self-care, particularly because of how long this has been, just as where we started. And I think those who are medically trained in this area would say it is very important that we pace ourselves and we're kind to ourselves, and we think about what brings us life, what brings us joy as well. Nick said something yesterday, I think it was helpful to another group of leaders. He said that he has appreciated in this season predictable patterns, which are part of our discipleship walk anyway. So as a team, we gather to pray at 9:30 in the morning. He was honest, he said, there are some mornings I don't really want to go because when you're at home or either there's crises going on or every day is like Groundhog Day, you know, here we go again. But I always come out of those times of praying and worshiping with life.
And Alex?
I'll be honest, I did this really badly, really badly. One of the first things I said in the week of the lockdown happened in March, that I said to our widest group of leaders, I said, we're about to go into a crisis. Things are going to be really hard. And do you remember what the air hostess always says? Put your mask on first before you help someone else. And we've got the same choice. We can either help half a dozen people and then collapse in a spiritual exhaustion, or we can take the time to put our mask on first, and then we're going to be able to help and rescue and save an awful lot more people. And I didn't follow my own advice at all. So I'll be honest, I've never been someone who struggled with my mental or emotional well-being before. I've been fortunate that, you know, through life to this date, I haven't. But I came into last summer in a very bad space without really being aware of that. I mean, and it dawned on me, the light bulb went off when a very nice member of our church knocked on our door, and he baked a massive chocolate cake for us, just out of the blue, just knocked, I just baked this cake for you, all the rest of it. And I just sobbed. I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed on the doorstep. It still makes me, you know, even now. And just sobbed, just absolutely sobbed. I don't think he had any idea what to do at all. And nor did I really. And I realized actually, you know, I'd not done some of the things that Marjorie's talking about. Not so much actually with my connection with God, that was actually fine. Or my connection with Hannah, my wife, that was fine. But just more surrounding my kind of emotional and mental well-being. You know, I'd gone to rescue others too much to the detriment of myself. And so I've been hugely helped by the more professional support that is available. And I'd want to encourage everyone to engage with that before you think you need it. And the Baptist Union provide a very good kind of counselling option at a very reduced rate for those who are in leadership of Baptist churches. And that's important. So, you know, my honest reflection is that sometimes it is a bit too much. And that is okay for it to be a bit too much. And that was my story. I'm on the other side of it now, you know, but it was very real at the time.
Things. I'd want to acknowledge that I have lost some of the things that genuinely did energize me. So, you know, I liked getting out whenever I wanted to. I liked getting out on the golf course, and that's not allowed now. And actually, that's much more than a selfish thing. It fed something within me to be out in creation doing something challenging. And some of the net options now I do, but they don't feed me in the same way. So lots of people are finding that the well-being challenge of what's been termed EPresentism at work, the need to be ever present online, and you're actually doing many more hours than you were doing rather than less. And I've definitely suffered from that at times, and even found myself getting kind of a blurry eye thing sometimes from just being on screen too much. So I've had to watch that and take time away from the screen. And it is surprising how well God does without us when we just don't worry about trying to get the next thing achieved. And it's surprising how often the next good idea comes and the next breakthrough comes in whatever you're working on, because I wasn't staying on the screen. I wasn't putting in the extra hours. You know, quality doesn't often come from just putting in the quantity. There's a balance to be found there.
And that's so helpful, because a lot of the stuff that we do, the purpose of this conversation in some ways is we listen to each other, don't we? We listen to each other, and all sorts of ideas and thoughts come to our mind, and we adapt things. We're listening to God and listening to each other continually and seeking to discern the way forward. and just that last bit, it shows how we're so connected. You know, we're not just spiritual beings or social beings, we're mental, emotional, physical beings. It's looking after us as integrated, looking after ourselves as integrated people, and making sure that we do find those things that give us life and energy. Else the world can start to become a little bit black, and we can start to get to a place where we feel hopeless. Are you hopeful as you look forward?
Absolutely, yeah. But you know, God will build His church, and we have the privilege of trying to tune into that. So
It's great.
Hugely hopeful.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, I'm tremendously hopeful. Absolutely, because the God we serve is still very much at work. But I am tremendously hopeful. I'm tremendously hopeful for the kingdom. However, I don't necessarily say that hope will translate to every individual church. I think God has given real responsibility to real people to keep in step with Him. So I'm incredibly hopeful for the kingdom. I think over the next 10 years, we're going to see more and more of a shift in the statistical evidence of what faith in Jesus looks like in the UK. I think we're going to see a lot more people saved, a lot more discipleship happening. I think it's going to be done in very different ways to the last 50 or 70 years. I think it's going to look very, very differently. But I also commend myself as someone called to serve a church, and all of us, that there is a big responsibility on us. So I'm hopeful for the kingdom, but what that looks like in each individual church, God has very graciously placed into our hands. And not all our churches are going to come out stronger, more vibrant, or more flourishing. And some of that will be because we make mistakes in not following where God is taking us. But when it comes to the kingdom, I think the UK we're going to begin to see a turn of the tide in very new and fresh and exciting ways. Yeah.
Good. Marjorie, you can bring our time to a close. Yeah, well, yeah.
I mean, by nature, I'm usually one of those hope-filled people, but I think the challenge for me in this season is one day at a time, and that is actually what I recommend pastorally to people as well. I think I'm one of these future-orientated people, so my heart beats for what God is doing. You know, what is the strategy? What will we do? What is God saying prophetically? Future-orientated, and actually, I find the Spirit of God, bringing me back to the today, and that there is hope for today. Open your eyes for today. Bless the people around you today. What can you do today? And what is God doing today? And I have found that really helpful to actually to keep that constant and that consistent hope that actually we can see the kingdom come today.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great. It's been a privilege for me just to listen to the conversation, ask questions. Got so many more questions I could ask, but I know folk are going to be hopeful, because not just because they're listening to you, but hopeful because they can see places where God's at work. Our prayer is that within the context in which people find themselves as they're listening here, it's no different. God's at work in our ordinary, everyday situations, the most unusual situations, the most mundane of situations. They're the encouraging stories to me. The places where you wouldn't expect God to be at work, and then they're the very places that God is at work. So it's great. We've really appreciated it. And if you're listening in, we want to encourage you and support you in all that you're doing, not just through listening to conversations like this, but want to encourage you to stay in touch with Kez and Clive and Mary and myself as we seek to pray with you and support you through this time, and do those very things that we've been talking about, which is discerning where God's at work within your community and joining him in that work. So thanks so much, guys. Great to be part of this conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Bless you.
Bless you.